So today we're talking about how JavaScript meets HTML and CSS. You guys might have noticed in the last homework that it feels very separate and like nothing's really interacting with each other between JavaScript and all the stuff that you guys have already been learning. Today is when we connect that all together. So first, we'll go through some announcements. So homework 7 is due like right now, and then homework 8 is released tonight, and will be due next week. Lab 7 will be due Tuesday, November 7th. We're going to release the final project like today, and I'll go through a little bit more details about that in a second. Grade reports will be sent out early this week. You guys might have received some grade reports, but we're doing some corrections and making sure that all of your points are accurate. And also, when we send out these slides, you'll be able to take a look at our showcase website. This has a couple of projects from previous semesters. I don't believe there's any from last semester, but there should be some from semesters prior to then. So yeah, keep on the lookout for that. In terms of the final project will be released on Notion, same place that you guys have been working on all assignments. And your goal is to create your own website from scratch. And there's like complete creative freedom. So you can do your own portfolio is what a lot of people have done in the past. There's also been projects on like different games that people wanted to make, maybe even just like some sort of like digital art of some sort, if you wanted to do that kind of thing. But yeah, you have complete creative freedom, so come up with something fun and just work on it for this amount of time. Yeah, your goal is to create a high fidelity mockup by next Tuesday, which is November 14th, and get it checked off by the in TA office hours to get 3 points. And if you don't get it checked off, your final score will be out of 29. Well, your maximum score would be 29 out of 32. And then final project will be due November 28th after Thanksgiving break. So you'll have 2 weeks to work on it, but one of them is going to be Thanksgiving break. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, do not start coding until you've been checked off, just because we want to make sure that your design is something reasonable and something that we can we think that is feasible for you and that is centered in terms of our like design philosophies. So yeah, let's get into lecture. So first we're covering these 4 main topics, which is reviewing variables and functions. There's going to be a new concept called objects. There's the DOM, which is where JavaScript and HTML meet. And there's, at the very end, we'll go into something you might actually use practically, which is adding and removing CSS classes with JavaScript. So first, let's go through kind of a review of last lecture. First, let's cover some variables. So variables are like what we use in math, like what X represents. We use a variable when we want to store a value and give it a name. So like, let name equal to Asia, I think. And this is like, if we're storing some text, we need to make sure that we put it in quotes, which is called a string. And that's different from when we say like, let age equal to 21. So because it's just a number that we're storing, we just store the number. Yeah, and we use this let keyword to say like we're making a variable here. Like anytime we use the word name, it's going to be referring to this Asia variable, and this age is always going to represent 21 unless we change it. Does that make sense to everyone in terms of how variables work? Cool. This is kind of the foundation of all like programming. So if you take some other classes like CS classes, or if you even start learning on your own, you'll encounter the same thing of variables. Yeah. So if there's any questions, this is a great time to ask. So if we do something with a variable, we want to store the result so that we can use it for later. And so we can store it in the same variable, or we can store it in a different variable. So we have this age name, which is which we define by saying let age, and then we set it equal to 20 plus 5. So the result will be 25 for this age variable in this first line here. And then the goal is to make the age variable change. So first, this first try at this, age minus 2.5, isn't gonna work right because we do that calculation, we do 25 minus 2.5, we get our 22.5, and then we just kind of like let it go. Like we did it and then we just don't have that anymore. Instead, we need to save it back into the age variable. So in the second line or the third line here, we have age equals to age times 2. And this age times 2 would be 25 times 2, which is 50. Does that make sense in terms of reassigning a variable? Okay, great. So reviewing for like these functions, functions are another thing that we talked about last week. Functions are basically like some code that we can run at a specific time and reuse it whenever we want. So that comes in two different parts. One is defining the function, and the second is calling the function. So when we define the function, we basically tell the computer that this is what code we want to do whenever we call this function. So the syntax for that starts with this keyword function that tells us that we're about to define a function. Then we name our function. In this case, we call it show greeting. And we give it what are called parameters, basically just what it's going to be using in the function. And that's called name. And then we use these little curly braces to say that this is the code that we're actually going to use. Any questions on how we define the function in terms of syntax? Okay. Does parameters make sense to everyone? Okay, cool. So in this function, we define show greeting to have this code which says let greeting equal to howdy plus name plus exclamation point. And then we have this alert greeting. So alert greeting is just gonna put it onto your browser. Yeah, so can someone tell me what the alert will say when we call this show greeting with miles in it? Hmm? Yeah, it'll just say howdy miles. Yeah, so we can do, yeah, we use these functions to do a lot of things. So one example is to just use it for alerts, so that we can kind of see what's happening, and alert the user that something went wrong or something like that. But another way we can use them is to do like math computation kind of thing. So here's an example of that. We have our function square, which takes in a number x, and returns that number times itself, which is just the definition of squaring a number. Yeah, and what this return means is that we are going to give that number back out to the call, if that makes sense. So when we have this square of 5, we run this function square on the value 5, and the square of 5 is 25. So when we return it, it comes back to the caller and sets it to this y variable. Does that make sense? This is where it gets a little bit dicey. Okay, cool. So yeah, we assign this y equal to 25, and then we can use this y variable inside of a function. So square of y is going to be 25 squared. I don't really know what number that is, but besides the point. Yeah, does this make sense in terms of variables and functions to everyone? Great. So now we're going to move on to a new concept, and this new concept is called objects. So yeah, we need to introduce this new concept. When we're connecting our code into like what is more of the real world in terms of like the internet, we have to describe things in a way that computers can understand and people can understand. So the only things that we've talked about in terms of like how we store data is like numbers, like we did in the functions examples and in our variables examples, and strings, which are just like small bits of like English. But yeah, what if we want to do something more complex? So the idea behind this is that complex things are just built out of a lot of smaller, simpler things. Um, so yeah, that's what objects are basically in all. So the new concept here is objects, and we'll give you this example of a car. Can someone tell me some like traits you might want to describe about a car? Yeah. Yeah, so like the color, any other examples? Maybe like the company it comes from, or like the year it was made, stuff like that. Like you can say a lot of things to describe a car that are like specific to that car. So for example, as we described, like objects are JavaScript's way of representing more complex things. Um, and they're made up of these two things. One of them is variables, which we call properties here. And the other is methods, which are functions here. So like we were talking about with variables and functions, basically an object takes a lot of them and puts them together. So the theme here is to think about what you're trying to do in English before you're trying to convert it into code. It's more difficult to think about it directly in terms of the code. And instead, if you just give it a description based on what you're thinking about, it's a little bit easier to understand. So yeah, here's the example of a car. Some properties of a car, like the color, the model, even its like current miles per hour. So like what speed we're currently going at. So what functions can a car do? It can go drive straight, it can brake, it can change colors. Well, the last one is not really possible in real life, but like you can let the computer do anything. So yeah, now we want to define our car object. So we have these properties, which are the color, the model, and the current miles per hour. And then we have our functions, which are drive straight, brake, and change color. So now let's get a little bit closer to code. So yeah, we define our properties as color, which is a string, the model, which is a string, and the miles per hour, which is a number. Does anyone have questions on how we got to that part of it? Okay, cool. So then we also have our functions, which are drive straight, brake, and change color, which takes in a color parameter. So now let's actually convert it directly into code. This might look a little overwhelming in terms of there's a lot of lines of code just like directly in a row, but we can break it down. So first is the properties. So we have our three properties, color, model, and miles per hour. In our current car object, we define it as being a red Tesla Model S, which is not moving. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, great. And after that, we define our three functions. Drive straight is a function that that doesn't take in parameters and just has some code, which we don't really care about right now. Brake, which is another function that doesn't take in parameters, and change color, which takes in new color. So yeah, this is a lot of really random syntax that doesn't really make too much sense. So don't worry about it too much because we won't be writing our own objects. Instead, the the way the internet has been set up has a lot of these objects that are already built into websites and browsers. So don't worry too much about this. Just recognize that we can store variables that can also just be objects that have these properties and functions. Does that make sense? Cool. So yeah, how do we use these object properties and functions? We can use them by like using this dot notation. And this is pretty common across like all programming. So we have our car object, which we defined in this left side. And if we want to kind of see what the car's color is, we can console.log this car.color. So console.log is just saying like, put it somewhere, and that somewhere is in like the inspect element that you guys explored in the last lab. And so this car.color is saying that we take our car object and we look up the colored property and we get that value. We can also do this car.driveStraight, which is saying that we call this function the driveStraight function, or we can car.changeColor, which takes in the argument blue. And yeah, so to call the object's function or to get a value stored, we use the dot. Does this make sense to everyone? Okay. So yeah, back to how HTML and JavaScript meet up. We're going to talk about the DOM now. So the DOM stands for it doesn't really matter, document object notation or mapping, something like that. Doesn't fully matter what it stands for though. This is just where we're connecting between HTML and JavaScript. So on the left, we have a pretty simple HTML file. We have this body tag, or this HTML tag, the body tag. We just have an H1 in there and an unordered list with 3 elements. And on the right side, we have kind of what the JavaScript is seeing. So we have this main document, which is defined by the HTML tag. We have the body inside of that. And we have 2 sides to the connection here. We have our H1 tag and we have our unordered list tag. And our unordered list also contains 3 separate list elements. Does everyone kind of see where we're coming from in terms of like comparing the two? Basically, any tag that is inside of another tag is going to be like a connection to that, if that makes sense. Cool. So here's the DOM, which is the document object model. When the HTML page is loaded, JavaScript creates its own representation of the same page. So anytime you reload a page, it's going to redo this calculation. Yeah, which is made up of a whole bunch of these objects that we just talked about. And each HTML tag is its own object. So this is a little bit more descriptive than the last diagram, but it's the same diagram. So we have our document, which has some functions and it has some properties. The document has a title, and it has these 2 things, get element by ID, get elements by class name, which we'll talk about. And then it goes into this body, and the body has some other properties, class list, inner HTML, style, and children. And then it continues down this path inside of each object. Does anyone have questions on this? How each tag is represented by an object? Cool. All right, so our first focus here is going to be this function called getElementById, document.getElementById. So getElementById is a function that takes in 1 argument, which is a string, which is the ID of the element that we want, and it returns that element's object, sorry. You guys might be familiar with the idea of like IDs in the HTML. You can define it, and then you use the same quotes that we use for strings in JavaScript to define the name of that ID. So, for example, this unordered list has an ID of food list. So we can get that ID by saying document.getElement by ID of food list. And then this list element variable will be defined to that object that represents that tag. Does that make sense? Cool. Perfect. So we'll go through an example of the properties of element objects. So again, this is what we got from that. This is what our list element is set to. So we have a couple of properties. Our class list, which is we'll cover all of these, but class list, inner HTML, style, and children. So we get this into food list, and then we can console.log the food list.class list, which makes like very little sense, but it ultimately results in this list called blue box. And that's because we have a little class called blue box on that same tag. Does that make sense? Okay, so we get our result, which is blue box, and we can also do this for inner HTML, which will result in our 3 little tags. And then we can console.log our children, which returns a list of the objects of our children. So why are we doing this again? This might seem a little like counterintuitive and like not really that useful yet, but recall from some of our examples that we can do a lot of interactivity with this. So when the user clicks on an image, we can increase its size because size is just a number and we can just add to that size. Yeah, so increasing its size just means changing its CSS width. We can also click on a button to change the colors to dark mode. And all that means is changing the CSS color and background colors. So we want to convert these into JavaScript code so that we know how to like connect everything together. So this button can be gotten by using the get element by ID. So maybe it's called dark mode button. And changing CSS is something that we're just about to get to. But there is another method, which is called document.querySelector. This query selector takes in one argument, which is a string, which is the CSS selector. This might be, you guys might know this as the thing that we define in the CSS file to actually get a specific, or to define a specific CSS. So for example, we might use hashtag like button or dot some name. So this returns the first element that matches that selector name. And it can be the same as document.getElement by ID. Yeah, so for example, we have this hashtag food list, which represents the same tag that we were talking about earlier, and it gives us the same thing. But we can also select just the first UL that we encounter, and that's going to be the same thing, but we're selecting it differently. So if there's multiple repeated names, the element will be the first one. So in here, when we read top to bottom, the first one that we see is child 1. So it'll be query selector will give us the first instance, which is this child 1. Does that make sense, how query selector is working? Great. Any questions up to this point on how JavaScript is meeting up with HTML? The second one we can get might be a little bit more difficult. We might have to define another class for it or another ID for it in order to specifically get that one. There is another method, which we don't really talk about here, which is get elements by class name. And that will just give us a list of all of the possible elements that fit that class name. So like if we looked up get elements by class of child, it'll just give us both of these, and then you can pick out which one. Great question. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so child 2, right now, the probably simplest way of doing it would be to do this same like document dot, but use a different function. So that different function is called get elements by class. And that'll just give you every possible element that has that class. If that makes sense. Another way you could do it is just give this second child a different ID, like maybe it's given ID of second child. Then you can just get element by ID of that specific one. Perfect. Any other questions? Great questions so far. Cool. Yeah, this can be really overwhelming because JavaScript is very different from HTML and CSS. So yeah, let's move on to kind of adding and removing CSS classes with JavaScript. So this is something where you might be able to change your styling and make it interactive. So we can take a look at properties of properties. So it turns out that the class list is not just a list, but it's another object. So now our code goes from this document, and it's connected to this food list, which we can get by get element by ID. And then that object, has a class list, which is in itself its own object. And so that object has these functions, add, remove, and toggle. So here we are, changing CSS with JavaScript. We can get our food list. We can get that class list, which gives us just this blue box that we added on. And we can add on a different class, which is called dark mode. And then our food list will now have two classes. One is the blue box that we had before, and dark mode, which we just added on. Does that make sense? Great. Any questions on this? Okay. So yeah, assuming that we have this class called dark mode in style.css, and the CSS file is linked properly, our HTML element will now have that same style, that the styles of dark mode applied to food list. So yeah, you might see that we're doing a lot of dots here, and that's because an object can give us a object in itself when we do a dot. So this document is an object that when we run this get element by ID, it gives us an object, and then this dot class list is an object, and then this dot add is just the function within that. So it's a lot of just nested stuff together, if that makes sense. Yeah, so we have this last step that we just added on, which is to use the dot add property, or function, sorry. And we can do the same thing with removing a class. So let's just say we just added we just added dark mode on, and we want to remove it again. We can just use dot remove instead. And that will just result in the same blue box being there. So yeah, we can have this interactive functionality now. So we can think of a feature to add to our web page. For example, like when the user clicks on this button or clicks on a link or clicks on an image, then we can add, change, or remove like some HTML or CSS. So yeah, now we can specify the element if it has an ID, and we can change, add, or remove CSS. So we'll put this all together in the next lecture, but hopefully this is a good insight into how powerful JavaScript can be in our websites and why almost every website contains JavaScript. Perfect. Any questions on this part of lecture? Okay, sounds good. We'll move on to